Tonight, we'll take a slow walk through the life of a man who lived by the sword, but found peace in silence. A man who wandered the misty roads of Japan, fighting over 60 duels and never losing once. Who began as a restless warrior and ended as a philosopher, writing not of battle, but of balance. This is the calm story of Miyamoto Musashi, the lone wolf of swords. Let your mind rest. Let the noise of the world fade away. You're listening to boring biographies for sleep. Now, before we begin, comment down below the time you're listening. Think of it as a small ritual, a way to track when you're choosing to rest, and to remind yourself that peace begins with consistency. Now, let's begin with the man who carried 2 swords, but only ever sought one truth. The year was 1584 in the quiet valley of Harima Province, Japan. The air hung heavy with cedar and smoke, the scent that lingered after battles ended, when peace was promised but never came. In a modest farmhouse surrounded by low mist and pine-covered hills, a child named Miyamoto Benosuke was born. One day the world would know him as Miyamoto Musashi, the most formidable swordsman Japan would ever produce. His father, Shinmen Munisai, already stood among the masters of his age, an instructor to regional lords, a duelist skilled in both sword and jita, the slender iron baton used to disarm without killing. He was a man who lived by precision and honor, his movements clipped, his voice exacting. But mastery has its cost. It narrows the world until only perfection remains. Munisai demanded that same perfection from all around him, and when the world failed to meet it, he grew distant. Musashi's mother, Omasa, was her husband's opposite, gentle, patient, often ill. Her early death left the household colder than steel. Munisai's discipline hardened into isolation. Father and son were 2 edges of the same blade, one forged to command, the other to resist. Quarrels became routine. Neighbors spoke of shouts that broke the night air, of the boy running barefoot through the fields, of a father who scolded even the wind for being unsteady. And then, one day, Munisai left. Some say he was called to serve another lord, others that he chose the path of the sword over the weight of fatherhood. Perhaps both were true. The man walked away, leaving behind his only son, a boy shaped by absence more than instruction. Musashi was sent to live with his uncle Dorin, a monk at Shorei Temple nestled in the hills. There, morning began with the ringing of bells and ended with the hush of prayer. Under that roof, the boy found 2 teachers, the discipline of the monks and the echo of his father's strictness. The monks gave him calm. His father's blood gave him persistence. He swept temple floors, chopped firewood, copied sutras. When no one watched, he practiced with sticks and bamboo poles, striking at shadows, testing rhythm, breath, distance. He didn't bow easily, spoke little, but every motion carried intent. To those who observed him, the boy seemed wild, yet unbreakably focused. Beyond the temple gates, Japan burned. It was the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States era, 100 years of shifting alliances and endless battle. Villages vanished overnight. Castles rose and fell like tides. Loyalty meant survival, not virtue. For a boy coming of age in such a time, the sword was not merely a weapon. It was a form of truth, a way to exist in a world that promised nothing. At 13, Musashi met his first test. A traveling samurai named Arimaki Hei arrived in the region, boasting of his skill and challenging all who dared oppose him. No one answered until the boy from Shori Temple stepped forward. The villagers tried to stop him. He was too young, too wild, too unknown. But Musashi's resolve was immovable. At dawn, they faced each other on the dusty road between fields. Kihei carried steel. Musashi, a rough wooden sword carved by his own hands. The air was still. Even the birds waited. Then, a shout, a blur of motion, and the boy struck once. The sound of wood against skull, followed by silence. Kihei fell. Musashi did not celebrate. He did not speak. He simply turned and walked away, his shadow long across the morning earth. That single moment divided his life in two. Childhood behind him, destiny ahead. Whispers spread through nearby towns. A boy who killed a man with a wooden sword. A prodigy possessed by something fierce. Yet within him, there was no pride, only a question that would guide his life. What is mastery if victory brings no peace? And though his father was gone, the lessons of both men endured, the monk's stillness, the warrior's precision. Together, they forged a path that would carry him through the wars, the wanderings, and the wisdom yet to come. Mist rising over cedar forests, a lone boy practicing with a wooden sword beneath temple bells, the duel frozen mid-swing, dust suspended in sunlight, a calm face, a quiet wind through bamboo, the beginning of a legend. By the time Miyamoto Musashi turned 16, Japan itself was changing. The fires of civil war that had burned for over 100 years were finally beginning to fade, leaving behind a land scarred but ready for rebirth. For generations, warlords had fought for power, clans had risen and fallen like waves, and the people had learned to live beneath the shadow of endless conflict. Now, in the year 1600, that chaos was drawing to its inevitable end. A single battle would decide the future of the nation, the Battle of Sekigahara. Two forces stood on opposite sides of the mist-covered valley. The Toyotomi loyalists, defending the memory of their late ruler Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and the Tokugawa clan, led by Tokugawa Ieyasu, marching toward a vision of unity, though unity, in Japan, would come only through conquest. Musashi joined the Toyotomi army, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of youthful pride, or perhaps because something in him was drawn to the sound of clashing steel, the only language he had ever known. He was barely a man, but already carried the reputation of a skilled duelist. His name had traveled in quiet whispers across villages, of the boy who fought without fear, who trained until his hands bled, and who never backed down from a challenge. But the battlefield was a world far removed from the clean rhythm of a duel. It was chaos. It was noise. It was death without reason. The morning of Sekigahara was soaked in fog and rain. Musashi stood among tens of thousands, a sea of armor, banners, and trembling hands gripping spears. The air was thick with gunpowder and fear. When the first volleys fired, the crack of muskets echoed like thunder. Drums pounded, horses screamed. The smell of earth and blood filled the valley. He fought not as a hero, but as a body among bodies, steel against steel, men shouting names that vanished in the wind. Every strike was survival, every breath uncertain. This was not honor, this was endurance. When the battle finally turned, the Toyotomi ranks began to break. Lords betrayed one another for promises of favor under Tokugawa's rising rule. Flags fell, orders crumbled into noise, and amid the chaos, Musashi found himself alone, just another survivor covered in the mud of defeat. Some stories say he escaped into the mountains, his armor torn, his sword nicked and dull. Others say he wandered for days among the corpses, searching for the meaning of a victory that had never been his. Perhaps both are true. What is certain is that he walked away from Sekigahara not as a warrior triumphant, but as a man stripped bare. He had entered the field seeking to prove himself. He left it with no master, no clan, and no certainty of what victory truly meant. In the new era that dawned under Tokugawa Ieyasu, Japan began to settle into peace. For many, it was a relief. But for men like Musashi, men born in the age of war, peace was a strange kind of exile. Without a master, he became a ronin, a samurai with no allegiance, a ghost in a world that had no more need for swords. Ronin drifted from province to province, hired for protection, for duels, for nothing at all. They were relics of a past that no longer fit the present. Yet for Musashi, this rootlessness became freedom. He owed no fealty, no obedience, no surrender of his will. His only lord was mastery itself. He began to wander the country, not in search of battle, but in search of understanding, testing his skill, not against men, but against the limits of the human spirit. In the stillness that followed Sekigahara, Musashi began to see the world differently. The clamor of war had been replaced by silence, and in that silence, he heard the faintest truth, that the real battle was not fought with swords, but within the self, between pride and humility, ambition and purpose, fear and peace. The boy who had once fought to be seen was beginning to learn the value of being unseen. The duelist who had once fought to survive was now fighting to understand why survival mattered. The world had changed, and so too would he. The next time he picked up his sword, it would not be to serve a lord, but to study life itself, to walk the long, lonely road that would one day lead him from battlefields to brushstrokes, and from violence to wisdom. The years after Sekigahara turned Miyamoto Musashi into a wanderer. With no master and no clan, he carried only his swords, his discipline, and an unrelenting hunger for mastery, not over others, but over himself. He roamed across the provinces of Japan, his path winding like the rivers that cut through them, from the mountain temples of Kyoto to the merchant streets of Nara, from the silence of remote villages to the courtyards of proud samurai schools that guarded their traditions like treasure. Wherever he went, he sought challenge. Every duel was not conquest, but study, a mirror in which he measured his flaws. To Musashi, defeat was not failure. It was an unlearned lesson. And so, he kept learning. He fought men from every school and creed, monks who had turned swordsmanship into meditation, mercenaries who fought for coin, students desperate to make their names by defeating him. He even fought entire dojos, sometimes defeating multiple opponents in succession, his technique raw, fluid, and unpredictable. Some duels began at dawn, when the mist still clung to the earth. Others took place at noon, in crowded squares, the audience murmuring as the ragged ronin stepped forward, unwashed, unkempt, carrying nothing that resembled the grace of a noble samurai. But when his blade moved, even the proudest lords fell silent. He broke every rule of form and etiquette. He struck early, attacked from unexpected angles, used the terrain, the sunlight, the dust in the air, anything that granted him advantage. To the formal schools, he was barbaric. To those who truly watched, he was genius. He once wrote later, "In battle, if you make your opponent flinch, you have already won." To Musashi, the essence of combat was not politeness, it was control. To control the timing, the space, the mind of the enemy. He fought as though his life depended on it, because each time it truly did. His legend began to grow quietly, carried by travelers and soldiers, passed in whispers over tea and sake. By his early 20s, his name had become a quiet rumor, the swordsman who never lost. No lord commanded him. No banner claimed him. He walked alone, but the world had begun to follow his shadow. And then, one duel changed everything. One duel would make his name eternal. It was around 1612, a small island off the coast of Shimonoseki, its sands white and empty, its only witnesses the sea and the sky. Ganryu Island. His opponent, Sasaki Kojiro. Tall, graceful, and deadly, the image of the perfect samurai. Kojiro's technique, the Tsubame Gaishi, the swallow cut, was said to be as fast and fluid as a bird's flight. His sword, impossibly long, almost as tall as a man, was named Monohoshi Zao, the clothes-drying pole. It was said that he could cut a leaf in midair, and the two halves would fall as one. Kojiro dressed immaculately, his movements elegant and precise, his demeanor calm. He was the portrait of refinement, a swordsman born for ceremony and admiration. Musashi, by contrast, was his mirror opposite. He arrived late, unkempt, unshaven, his clothes wrinkled from travel, and in his hand, not a blade of steel, but a wooden sword, carved roughly from the oar of the very boat that brought him to the island. To some, it was arrogance. To others, strategy. But to Musashi, it was simplicity, to strike with what was available, and to show that the sword mattered less than the mind that guided it. Kojiro waited, standing tall in the sunlight. When he saw Musashi's rough appearance, his pride ignited into fury. He drew his sword in one smooth arc, its edge catching the morning light like lightning. The air grew still. The waves whispered. Musashi stepped forward, barefoot, his eyes steady, his breath calm. There was no bow, no greeting, no formal salute, only the pause before destiny. Then, in a single movement, Musashi lunged. The wooden sword cut through the air with terrifying speed and struck. The sound of wood meeting flesh echoed across the shore. Kojiro fell. The sea sighed, and silence returned to the island. Musashi stood for a moment, unmoving. The wind tugged gently at his sleeve. Then, without a word, he turned, walked back to his boat, and pushed off into the tide. Behind him, the waves washed away their footprints, leaving no trace of what had transpired, only the faint memory of perfection. That duel became legend. Some saw it as proof of Musashi's unmatched skill. Others condemned it as a disgrace, a breach of etiquette, an insult to the traditions of the samurai. But for Musashi, it was neither victory nor sin. It was revelation. For the first time, he had conquered every possible opponent and found no joy in conquest. The act of winning had lost its meaning. What was left to master when even perfection began to feel hollow? From that day on, Musashi laid down the path of dueling. He turned away from fame and applause and began a quieter pilgrimage, one not of swords, but of spirit. He sought to understand how to win without fighting, how to live without fear, how to move in harmony with all things. The island of Ganryu was where his legend was born. But it was also where the swordsman died, and the philosopher began to awaken. After Ganryu Island, something within Miyamoto Musashi began to shift. The thrill of battle, once so intoxicating, had turned hollow. The clang of blades, the cheers of witnesses, even the quiet pride of another victory, none of it stirred him anymore. He had proven himself to men, but in the stillness that followed, he began to realize that victory over others meant little when one had not yet conquered the self. The sword, once his companion, began to reveal a different truth. It was no longer merely a weapon. It was a mirror, and what it reflected was not glory, but solitude. The endless search for perfection had cost him everything else: companionship, belonging, peace. He had defeated countless opponents, but each duel only deepened the silence around him. So Musashi set aside the path of blood and honor and began a new kind of journey, one that would require greater discipline than any battle before. He turned inward. He wandered again, but this time not to find opponents, to find understanding. His steps carried him through forests and riverbanks, mountain temples and small villages where the sound of bamboo and water replaced the clash of steel. He rejected invitations from lords who wished to keep him as a retainer, ignored offers of gold, and turned away from fame that followed his name like a shadow. Where others sought recognition, Musashi sought stillness. He had learned that the noise of the world is loudest when a man does not yet know himself. He began to study art, not as decoration, but as another form of battle. In painting and calligraphy, he found the same flow that guided a sword stroke, a single, irreversible motion requiring full presence. A misplaced brushstroke, like a mistimed strike, could not be undone. To move without hesitation, that was the essence of mastery. He carved wooden sculptures, each chisel mark deliberate, each imperfection accepted as part of the whole. He studied Zen Buddhism, learning to still his thoughts and to see the spaces between them, the same spaces he had once read between his enemy's movements. To Musashi, these were not hobbies. They were forms of strategy. Discipline expressed through gentleness, control expressed through calm. He once wrote, "The ultimate aim of martial arts is not having to use them." To many, that seemed like contradiction. To Musashi, it was evolution. The sword was never about killing. It was about seeing clearly. During these years, Musashi found refuge under Lord Hosokawa Tadatoshi in Kumamoto. Hosokawa was no ordinary ruler. He was a man of letters, a poet, a scholar of Zen. Where others saw in Musashi a weathered wanderer, Hosokawa saw depth, a mind sharpened not by ambition, but by reflection. Under Hosokawa's quiet patronage, Musashi found something rare: peace without idleness. He trained younger samurai, but his lessons reached beyond the sword. He taught them to watch the wind move through trees, to hear rhythm in silence, to find stillness even while striking. He told them, "The way of the sword and the way of life are one and the same." To his students, this was confusing at first. They came seeking combat, but found philosophy. They expected drills, but were told to practice patience. Musashi's method was not to command, but to reveal. He would ask, "How do you hold your brush? How do you draw your sword? Can you do both with the same heart?" To him, the sword and the brush were the same instrument. Both required balance, precision, rhythm, and courage. Both demanded that one act at the perfect moment, no sooner, no later. It was in this period that Musashi refined his own fighting style, Niten Ichi Ryu, two heavens as one style. The art of wielding two swords at once, one long, one short, as extensions of a single spirit. He did not invent the idea of dual wielding, but he perfected its philosophy. The right hand and the left, offense and defense, movement and stillness, in harmony, not opposition. He wrote that each hand must know the other's heart. To him, that was not about swordsmanship alone, but about the unity of thought and action. A true warrior's mind, he believed, must be unbroken, able to hold both calm and intensity in the same breath. Those who met Musashi in these later years found a man transformed. Gone was the fierce duelist with unkempt hair and a restless temper. In his place stood a quiet teacher, weathered, composed, and thoughtful. He no longer sought to impress. His voice was low, his presence steady. When he spoke, it was not to command, but to share truths drawn from a life lived on both sides of the blade. He would sit for hours watching cranes in flight or painting a single bird on a branch. His famous works, Shrike on a Dead Tree, Wild Geese Among Reeds, capture more than beauty. They capture restraint. Each stroke deliberate, each pause intentional. His art, like his philosophy, contained no waste, only what was necessary. To Musashi, mastery was not about addition, but subtraction, to remove all that was unneeded until only truth remained. Through every brushstroke, every breath, every word of advice, he continued the same pursuit he had begun as a boy in the temple yard, to understand where strength truly lives. Not in muscle, not in speed, not even in victory, but in the quiet clarity that comes when a person no longer seeks to prove anything at all. By his later years, Miyamoto Musashi had become a man at peace with both the sword and the silence that followed it. The echoes of battle, once the rhythm of his life, had faded into the distance, replaced by the slow, deliberate breath of reflection. The restless wanderer of his youth had given way to a figure of quiet dignity, a man content not in conquest, but in understanding. No longer a duelist or a drifter, he was simply a man, living in harmony with the world he once sought to challenge. His companions were few. The whisper of a brush across paper, the weight of a wooden chisel in his hand, and the endless murmur of his own thoughts. He had fought his way through life, and at last he had arrived at stillness. In these tranquil years, Musashi created art as patiently as he once prepared for war. The same discipline that had guided his sword now flowed through the tip of his brush. He turned to inkwash painting, or sumi, where mastery lies not in detail, but in restraint, in knowing when to stop. Among his surviving works are Shrike Perched on a Dead Branch and Wild Geese Among Reeds. At first glance, they seem simple, a few strokes of black ink on white paper, but look longer and they come alive. The shrike seems ready to take flight. The reeds bend just enough to suggest the whisper of wind. Each brushstroke was a meditation, a movement balanced between intent and surrender. He painted not to impress, but to see. Each stroke, each pause of the hand, was a study in impermanence, the fleeting nature of form and life itself. Musashi often said that the brush and the sword were one. Both demanded clarity of mind, precision of motion, and the courage to move without hesitation. He also immersed himself in the tea ceremony, a practice that turned simplicity into grace. To most, it was a social ritual. To Musashi, it was a form of meditation, a way to find mastery in small acts. The pouring of water, the folding of a cloth, the stillness of a bow. All were expressions of discipline, of living fully in a single moment. He studied sculpture too, chiseling wood and stone with the same deliberation that once guided his sword. He believed that carving form from matter was no different than shaping character from struggle. Through patience, roughness gave way to elegance. Through repetition, imperfection revealed truth. To Musashi, these were not hobbies or pastimes. They were strategies, the continuation of a lifelong study in control, balance, and presence. He once wrote, "The ultimate aim of martial arts is not having to use them." It was not contradiction. It was transformation. Violence, he had learned, was merely the beginning of understanding. To never need the sword. That was mastery. Though solitude defined these years, Musashi was not alone. At his side was his adopted son, Miyamoto Iori, a loyal and capable samurai who served with honor under Lord Hosokawa. To Iori, Musashi was more than a teacher. He was a living philosophy, a man who taught not by command, but by example. They spoke little, but understood much. When they shared tea, there was no need for words. When they trained, there was no need for instruction. Between them stretched a bond born of mutual respect, the quiet, unspoken understanding that both men walked the same path, one of purpose, humility, and peace. As the seasons turned, Musashi withdrew further from the world. His body, once unbreakable, began to tire. He chose not the comfort of a house or the luxury of a city, but the solitude of a cave carved into the limestone hills outside Kumamoto, Reigando, the spirit rock cave. There, he built a small space of his own making, a mat, a writing desk, a few candles, and his two swords resting silently against the wall. He rose with the sun, ate little, and spent his days writing, painting, and meditating. The cave's dripping water became his clock, marking time more gently than any bell. It was in this silence that he would compose the philosophy that defined his soul, the Book of 5 Rings. The text was unlike anything written before it, a fusion of strategy, perception, and spirit. It was not a manual for battle, but a study of the human condition through the art of combat. Musashi described life as composed of 5 rings or elements: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. Earth was foundation, the grounding of discipline, the stability of purpose. Water was adaptability, the ability to flow around obstacles without losing form. Fire was intensity, the drive to act when the moment demanded. Wind was awareness, the study of others, the wisdom to learn from every school and every mind. And void, the final ring, was the great unknown, the realm beyond technique and thought, where true mastery resides. "If you know the way broadly," he wrote, "you will see it in everything." To Musashi, the way, the do, was not confined to swordsmanship. It lived in every act performed with total attention, in the motion of painting a single line, the careful pour of tea, the measured breath before death. When a person lives completely in each moment, he believed, the world itself becomes his teacher. In the stillness of Reigando Cave, Musashi became something greater than a swordsman. He became a philosopher, not of words, but of silence. He discovered that strength was not in the strike, but in the restraint that prevents it. Not in dominance, but in understanding. The same man who once roamed the country seeking opponents now found his only opponent within himself. And finally, he made peace. The swords that had once defined him stood quietly in the shadows. His brush, now his true weapon, glided softly across parchment. And in every stroke, every measured breath, he continued the same search that began in his boyhood. The search for balance between movement and stillness, between mastery and surrender, between life and the silence that must one day follow it. As the years passed, the once restless swordsman grew still. The hands that had once gripped a blade with unyielding force now trembled slightly with age. The eyes that once read an enemy's intent in the blink of an instant now lingered instead on the play of light across a cave wall. By the early 1640s, Miyamoto Musashi was entering his 60s, an age few warriors of his era had the luxury to see. His body was marked by a lifetime of travel and combat. Decades of wandering the provinces had hardened and worn him in equal measure. The aches in his joints deepened each winter. His fingers sometimes refused to close fully. Modern historians believe he suffered from rheumatism or neuralgia, but Musashi never once described his pain as suffering. He treated it as a final master, a silent opponent that demanded patience rather than power. For where others feared weakness, Musashi found wisdom. He saw in aging a final test, not of skill, but of surrender, a challenge not of the sword, but of the soul. He retreated deeper into his refuge at Regondo Cave, the same stone sanctuary that had echoed with his brushstrokes and meditations for years. It was here, surrounded by dripping water and the sighs of wind through rock, that he decided to live out his remaining days. The cave itself was austere, little more than a mat, a writing desk, a candle that burned low into the night, and his two swords resting quietly against the wall. Yet within its darkness, he found light. The days passed in rhythm, slow and deliberate. He rose with dawn, washed his face in cold mountain water, and sat cross-legged to write or carve. By day, he painted in the faint sunlight that reached through the cave's mouth. By night, he wrote by the flicker of a single candle, its smoke curling like ink into the air. Outside, the world continued its steady march of politics and power. Inside, Musashi measured time by the drip of water and the beating of his own heart. The man who had once fought with two swords now fought only with time, and slowly he began to win. It was during these final months that Musashi began to compose one last text, a brief, intimate work meant not for students of war, but for anyone who wished to understand themselves. He called it Dokodo, the way of walking alone. Unlike his Book of Five Rings, which explored combat and perception, the Dokodo was stripped of philosophy and metaphor. It was distilled truth, pure, simple, like the faint sound of a bell fading into silence. Just 21 short principles, each one written with the same clarity he had spent a lifetime seeking. Each line, a stone placed carefully on the path to freedom. Accept everything just the way it is. Do not fear death. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Resentment and complaint are appropriate neither for oneself nor others. Be detached from desire your whole life long. There were no elaborate teachings, no flowery words. It was the voice of a man who had seen all forms of victory and defeat, and who now understood that peace could only be found through letting go. He urged detachment not from love or beauty, but from possession. the illusion of control. To live freely, he wrote, one must be able to hold everything lightly, even life itself. The Dokudo was not a manual for living. It was a final confession, the summation of everything he had learned from war, art, and solitude. It reads like a whisper from someone who had already stepped halfway into eternity. As spring approached in 1645, Musashi knew his time was near. His health had weakened, but his mind remained sharp. Sharper, perhaps, than it had ever been. He cleaned his swords one final time, not as weapons, but as relics of a journey completed. He wrote his last letters to Lord Hosokawa and his son Iori, and gave away his meager belongings to those who had cared for him. Everything in his cave was in perfect order, down to the positioning of his inkstone. Even in death, he would meet the world with discipline. On the morning of his passing, the air outside was pale with mist. Inside the cave, Musashi dressed in full ceremonial robes. He tied his hair neatly and sat upright upon his mat, his back straight, his eyes open and steady. He placed his long sword across his lap, its edge facing upward, and turned to face the east, toward the rising sun. Those who later found him said he looked entirely serene, not a trace of struggle, only the calm of a man who had practiced his final act as thoroughly as any duel. He took one slow breath in, then released it, as if exhaling the last weight of the world. And in that silence, Miyamoto Musashi departed. The sun rose higher over the mountains of Kumamoto, its first light spilling into the cave, gilding the scrolls on his desk, their ink still wet. The faint scent of pine and stone lingered in the air, as if the world itself paused to honor his stillness. To his followers, this was not a death. It was a final teaching, a demonstration of how to meet the inevitable with composure, clarity, and grace. He had faced countless men and countless blades, but in the end, the only opponent that remained was time itself, and he met it without fear. The swordsman, who had never been defeated, had achieved a victory greater than any duel, the mastery of letting go. Centuries have passed since Miyamoto Musashi took his final breath in the quiet of Reigondo Cave, yet his presence lingers, faint but unbroken, like the hum of a string long after the note has ended. His spirit moves through Japan, not as a ghost of war, but as a quiet current beneath everything that values discipline, balance, and awareness. He lives in the way a painter's hand hovers before the first stroke, in the breath a swordsman takes before his blade leaves the scabbard, in the still moment of thought before action. His techniques, once forged in the chaos of battle, have long transcended violence. The school he founded, Nitten Ichi-ryu, two heavens as one style, remains a living lineage. To this day, in dojos scattered across Japan and beyond, students kneel before simple wooden floors, bow in silence, and practice the same forms Musashi once devised. They learn to wield two swords, one long, one short, not for the purpose of killing, but to learn balance, the perfect unity of mind and body, left and right, movement and pause. The style endures not because it is complicated, but because it is true. Each motion holds the same quiet principle Musashi discovered in the stillness of his cave, that mastery is never about power. It is about perception. Not seeing more than others, but seeing clearly what is already there. Even centuries later, the students of Nitten Ichi-ryu do not speak of Musashi as myth. They speak of him as presence. Every cut, every breath, every stance, a conversation with a man who understood that the greatest strike is the one perfectly measured and perfectly restrained. In Japan, his name carries a dual weight: the blade and the brush, the warrior and the monk. He is remembered not merely as a swordsman, but as a philosopher of being, a man who conquered himself long before he conquered others. In his lifetime, his name was whispered with caution. Now it is spoken with reverence. Statues rise in his image. Temples dedicate quiet alcoves to his teachings. The country that once bled from endless war now honors the man who found peace through discipline. He is quoted by soldiers and scholars, by artists and athletes, by anyone who has ever sought stillness within chaos. For Musashi's words, written by candlelight and solitude, outlived the sword that once defined him. To win without fighting is the highest skill. That single sentence became the thread that binds his world to ours. His philosophy stretches far beyond martial arts, into strategy, leadership, creativity, and life itself. Modern generals have studied the Book of Five Rings alongside Sun Tzu's The Art of War and Machiavelli's The Prince. Artists draw inspiration from his insistence on minimalism. Athletes and martial artists quote his lessons on rhythm and timing. Business leaders study his principles of adaptability and observation. And seekers of peace, monks, poets, even ordinary people, find in his writings a way to face their own battles, the ones no sword can cut. Walk through a bamboo forest in Japan, and you may feel him there, in the hush before the wind, the sound of leaves bending but never breaking. The forest breathes in rhythm, like a warrior before a duel. Stand at the shorelines of Shimonoseki, where waves strike the same rocks that heard the echo of his duel with Sasaki Kojiro. Each wave crashes and recedes, an eternal rhythm of motion and stillness, just as Musashi once taught. The flow between strike and silence, the pulse of life itself. In ancient temples, where incense rises like mist, monks still chant verses about balance and awareness. Concepts Musashi lived, not wrote. Their footsteps have polished the stone floors smooth over 4 centuries of meditation. The same patience, the same devotion, the same stillness that guided Musashi's brush and blade echoes in their chants. If you listen closely, you can almost hear his voice traveling through the quiet halls of time. Do nothing that is of no use. Perceive that which cannot be seen. In 1,000 days of training, you will begin to see the way. In 10,000 days, you will master it. These are not merely instructions. They are invitations to live deliberately, to act with presence, to seek not control, but clarity. Miyamoto Musashi remains, even now, a paradox, a storm wrapped in silence. A man who spent his youth chasing death and his later years studying life. He lived by the sword, but died by understanding it. And through that understanding, he transcended the need for it. Every person who reads his words, who seeks calm amid chaos, who practices mastery not of others but of self, walks a fragment of his path. 400 years have passed, and still, the man who once fought 60 duels and never lost teaches us how to live. His legacy is not carved in stone, nor trapped in history books. It lives in every artist who seeks simplicity, every leader who values patience, every thinker who looks beyond the surface. Musashi's final victory was not survival, it was enlightenment. And in that victory, he remains forever undefeated. And so ends the quiet story of Miyamoto Musashi, a man born in an age of chaos who learned that the truest victory was not found in battle, but in the stillness that follows it. He lived through the rise and fall of empires, through duels that echoed across generations, and through the long silence of solitude. Yet in the end, his greatest triumph was not the blade he wielded, but the peace he carved from within. He had mastered his sword, his art, his spirit, until all three became one and the same. A warrior who sought peace through understanding conflict, a philosopher who saw beauty in impermanence, a man who walked alone but left behind a path for all who search for meaning. Miyamoto Musashi's life was not about the sword he carried, but the silence he found when he finally put it down. So as you rest tonight, may your mind be still, your breath steady, and your dreams calm as morning mist. You've been listening to Boring Biographies for Sleep. Good night.